Welcome back, Tommy.
Thank you.
I know you were gallivanting in Paris someplace.
We're in Geneva
And
and then France, the Alps. Then the snow here.
then the snow, beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah.
But we had some here.
We didn't have a single flake,
Oh,
but it
great.
had snowed the week before. It was beautiful.
How are you?
All right, how are you?
Hanging in there.
Yeah, that's about right.
That's it. That seems to be universal these days.
Yes. Challenging times.
Boy, yeah, to put it mildly. Yeah. I think we should get started. What do you think? Okay, just want to be sure. Um, and there are a number of things I would like for us to reflect on. And we began talking a little bit last time about Moses and the wilderness experience. And in part, I wanted to emphasize that sometimes hospitality comes in a variety of different ways. And we may not either see the vocabulary in the text that says, heads up, this is about hospitality. We never see that. But we see what happens about this. And during the course of the week, none of this should come as a surprise to you, but during the course of the week, it seems that every day I'm thinking something else is happening. That you've seen this too? Okay. Something is happening, and should I change how I approach this? And sometimes my work gets into the way of doing this. So I'm not always able to change things, but I want to reflect on a couple of things in the larger context of this. We should not be surprised, for example, that the word hospitality is, of course, by the very letters of the word is associated with, of course, let's go with hospital, okay? And that at least in general, if we are heading to a hospital, there are certain basic things that would be in play. One, okay, something is wrong here, okay? I'm assuming we do not just go to the hospital for fun, okay? If you do that, I think there are some other issues you have to deal with. But we go there, largely speaking, for healing, right? And the hope that in that context, healing will happen. The second thing I want to emphasize as we think about this, and we'll get back to our friend here in a second, that there are places where on the surface it would seem to be an odd place for newness and for new beginnings, okay? And biblically speaking, one of those places that is very obvious and is very common and it's all over the place, particularly in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, that place is, of course, the wilderness. We don't think of wilderness as a place for newness and new beginnings, and yet it is exactly the place where, of course, Moses and the people are when something is forged that will happen, not in the timeline that we have, but in a particular timeline, in time to come. But we also see this, by the way, for example, in the prophet Hosea. Hosea talks about God wooing. We don't use that language these days anymore, but God wooing, courting the people, and forging a new relationship. And where does it happen? In the wilderness. It seems to be counterintuitive. And yet, it is precisely in times of desperation, in times that are difficult, in times that are challenging, in times when we can't see, as C.S. Lewis once says, when you're wondering what lies a mile ahead and you're going around a bend, pause. Just wonder what lies maybe 3 feet ahead so you can get on the straightaway. All right. So sometimes it's very difficult. The third thing I want to emphasize is this. We can speak of hospitality in a way that is, let's say, theoretical. It is not theoretical. I want to say that as clearly as I know. It has to do with action. And again and again, we see within the biblical tradition, it doesn't just have justice and righteousness without any subject or predicate, and then you do with it as it always says what? Act justly. Okay, it has to do with action. Be just. Okay, seek justice for the oppressed. Okay, take care of the widow and the orphan. Not surprisingly, these are generally folks who are the bottom of the social and economic ladder. Take care of those who, by the way, in different contexts may not be able to take care of themselves. That's what we do. That's part of hospitality. Okay. Fourth, and sometimes I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, and I know many of you are actually in the choir. But fourth, be kind. It is one of the cornerstones of hospitality. Kindness. Kindness. Compassion. Where we know that the word compassion has its roots meaning what? And by the time we are all finished and you're entirely sick of Latin and Hebrew and Greek, okay, then we'll resume in September. But compassion, of course, literally means with, with, I love this. By the way, I love this because you said with passion, right? That's true. It's very difficult. By the way, I was waiting for one of the kids up there when we had the squiggly line to say, I think Jesus. By the way, you cannot ever go wrong when, I mean, you cannot. There is no, you cannot have your teacher say, well, I'm sorry, that's the wrong answer. Okay. I was waiting for one of the kids because, of course, how can you go wrong? But of course, the word means into or with suffering. That's what it means. That's why we do not need to show compassion to those who are, sort of giddy with happiness. Okay? But it is to enter into the suffering of the other. And it's too bad that over the years, what now much more commonly we refer to as Palm Sunday used to be what? Passion Sunday, right? And that's the way it was. Okay. So we want to show compassion. We want to be kind. And so during the week, in all of the stuff that is happening in our world, both in close communities, okay, in larger communities, clearly in the nation, okay. By the way, I'm not broaching something that you're unaware of, but also in the world in which we live. And I was thinking about this. About 6 years or so ago, 7 years ago, and you may remember there was a representative in Congress by the name of Elijah Cummings. You remember Elijah Cummings? Okay. Who represented for a number of years a section of Baltimore. And if I remember correctly, his house was burglarized, or I think it was burglarized if I'm not remembering correctly. Anyway, and some things were stolen, and maybe there was a fire or something like that. And the president at the time said, well, essentially, that serves you right for living in a city that is really, really terrible. Okay, and you don't take care of your people. So, I mean, that was the response. And I was thinking about this, about kindness, about care, and about the force of our words with each other. And with what we heard this morning about loving the enemies, the bar is very high and difficult there, because the natural human instinct is not to do that. The natural human instinct is that you hurt me, and therefore I will find a way to hurt you. And so I went back, And John Quincy Adams, stay with me now, okay, had his home destroyed. And John Adams wrote to Abigail a letter. And here is an excerpt from that letter that I found 200 plus years later to be instructive about maybe the use of our words, of our caring, of our compassion. And this is the direct quote now. It was in Boston. The home suffered, in their words, abominable damage. By the way, we don't even use that word anymore, right? But that was the description. And this is part of that letter. Whenever vanity and gaiety, a love of pomp and dress, furniture and equipage, buildings, great company, expensive diversions, and elegant entertainments get the better of principles and judgment of men and women, there is no knowing when they will stop into what evils, natural, moral, or political, they will us. End of quote. Okay? Some things change in our lives, and some things remain the same, as you know. Now, the other thing I would say, again, by way of introduction, as I've been thinking about this, there's an old adage that says, time heals all, okay? Time will heal everything, right? Wrong-o. Okay? No. I'm sorry if I'm destroying your Santa Claus doesn't exist or what. No. We have read, for example, King's letter from Birmingham jail. Okay? And if you haven't read it, this is not homework, so don't freak out on me here. Okay? If you haven't read it, let me invite you to read it. And once you have read it, what should you do? Read it again and again. There are some things that should be read more than once, and of course, as you well know, there are certain books that should never be read, and you weep for the trees that gave life to them. Okay? But read this again and again. And then when you encounter the names in that letter, go and find out who those people are, including Old Testament prophets, but also others. And in that letter, King says, time is neutral. It is what you do with that time that matters. The point is, don't simply sit back and say, time heals all ills, it's going to be fine. What are we going to do? What are you going to do with the time that we have been given, that we have at our disposal? And of course, the question should elicit from us an answer that says, we have to do something. Whatever that something is, it's not meant to be prescriptive, but something. Time heals all things, if you will. So we get to our friend Moses, and he is with the people in the wilderness, and like all, it seems like it's a universal human factor. Before long, what are the people doing? They're complaining. The King James Version and some other versions say, of course, they were murmuring. Okay? I think they were doing a little bit more than murmuring. Okay? They were complaining. And part of the complaint had to do with, really can only be described as a very faulty memory here. I cannot believe after a few weeks you have brought us out from Egypt, where we were sitting by the flesh pots and eating bread and meat to our full desire. Okay? Ding ding. Okay? Okay? Bad memory. Okay? Sort of selective amnesia. No, you weren't eating by the flesh pots. Let me remind you. And this is one of the things about being a leader. Okay? God says to Moses, you're at fault here. And by the way, you can almost begin to extrapolate from the text where Moses wants to say to God, no, it's not. Did you hear me complaining? But when the people complain and you're the leader, guess who is responsible? You. Okay? And you may not like it, but too bad. And God says, you're the one. And so Moses says to the people, you may complain. And the actual words are, your complaining is not against me, but it is against the Lord. So keep complaining. But you should know that every time you do that, it's against the Lord. So, of course, again, you think about we're hungry. And sometimes context matters. A few years ago, one of my, at the time at the university, one of my students who was in the class, he came in to see me in my office. And he said, Dr. Kasai, you were talking about, I can't remember the exact context. We were talking about something, and something happened over the weekend that struck me in light of what we were discussing. And he said it has to do with vocabulary, but it's more than that. He said, I went to see my grandma, who is elderly. And when I went in, I said to her, Grandma, I am starving. Okay? And his grandma says to him, no, you're not. His grandma said to him, you're not starving. She said, I lived through the Great Depression and I know what starving is. You may be hungry, but you're not starving. Okay? So the people are complaining that this is the stuff you're given to us. We are starving. We don't have anything. And of course, God provides. And again, to sort of even parse that word itself, what does it mean? What does it mean literally to provide? To give? For life? What else? What literally does it mean? Think about it. By the way, this is one of these fun exercises because I happen to know that you know what it means, but you're not sure that you know what it means. But of course, if you split the word, and this, by the way, this is the word that gives us word like video, for example. Okay? It literally means that a person who provides is a person who has the capacity to see ahead. Literally, as in, vision, video, sight. Okay? And so to provide, when God provides, God is saying to the people, I can see what lies ahead and I will give you. Some of us may remember that there are certain kinds of vegetables that are called what? I'll go ahead and tell you. Provisions. Okay? And often provisions, they refer to that which actually are growing kind of like potatoes, kind of like yams. Okay? Where do you get them? You really can't see them. These are not tomatoes now. Okay? They are underground. Okay? There is a sense in which to provide is something that you have to have a vision that lies before, that lies ahead, that you cannot see. And God says, I will provide for the people. And what God provides for the people, what we have inherited, it's one of these Hebrew words that we still use, of course, whether or not we realize we're using it, it's still a word that we use in our common vocabulary. God provided what for the people? Manna, right? Manna, which is really two Hebrew words joined together. But manna really means, of course, what is this? Okay, so the stuff is coming down, and the Hebrew says it's manna, but in English, we don't know, we didn't translate it. It simply means, essentially, what's this stuff? You can imagine the tone here. This is not like I'm walking along and I see a shiny thing and I realize I have found a diamond, and I'm thinking, oh wow, what is this? This is, what in the Sam Hill is this? That's what it is. What in the world is this? Okay, you have provided food, and this is what provision is? Again, the complaint. And God says, listen, they will have meat for evening and bread for morning. Okay? And every day, hear me out with this. Every day, you have to go and collect it. Right? You have to go and collect it. And when you collect your manna from heaven in the morning, what do you need to do with that? You have to consume this. You have to eat it. Because if you don't, it goes bad. But every day you have to do this. For 6 days. And then what happened on the 6 days? You collect double. And you collect double, why? Because we have this Sabbath thing. Okay? And the Sabbath is supposed to do what? A Sabbath is the time of rest, right? I want for us to talk a little bit about the Sabbath and rest. Let me see if I can find it here so I can give you the exact text. And this might seem to be a question that has a self-evident answer, but humor me here. What does it mean to rest on the Sabbath? We're not talking about the ancient Israelites now. We're not talking about folks 2,000 years ago. We're not talking about our ancestors. Now, for us, in this time and in this place, the question is, what do we understand by rest on the Sabbath?
No emails.
No emails. Okay? By the way, you may not have any control over emails, but it might have to do with reading and responding to emails. Okay? What else does rest have to do? No work. No shopping. You say that almost with a tone of distress. Okay, I don't want to read anything into no shopping.
Was it not a time to procreate?
It might be a time to procreate. It doesn't say that, but it doesn't prevent that either. Okay? Because I don't want you to start running to Pastor Dave saying that, saying that.
Observant Jews cannot operate an elevator, so they have special elevators on the Sabbath.
Okay. So let me talk a little bit about this. So a few years ago, actually several years ago, there was a series of what was known as Nobel Peace Conferences. And what it was is that up in the upper Midwest, in Minnesota, in that area, the Nobel Institute had funded a number of these sort of conferences to talk primarily about peace. And I went to the first that they had, and I was in that teaching in that area at the time. And there are several keynote speakers. Okay, there were 2 Nobel laureates who spoke, Elie Wiesel being the primary one, but there is also a woman from Northern Ireland, Margaret Maguire, who won the Nobel Peace Prize as well. We don't hear much about her, but her story is absolutely unbelievably riveting. And Walter Mondale, some of you may remember, the Minnesota former senator and vice president, also spoke. And then there were about a dozen sort of scholars and professors type who did smaller presentations, and I was fortunate to be one of those people, talking about peace. After Elie Wiesel spoke, and if you've ever heard him, and certainly if you've read his stuff, you will know, right, that it leaves a mark. And if it doesn't, I think we have some other things we need to talk about. It leaves a mark that I would even suggest that is indelible. But after his lecture, I had a chance to visit with him in a conversation about a variety of things, including what he's spoken about, what I was working on at the time as a young, my first sort of position as a professor. And while we were speaking, a gentleman came up and said, with a copy of Wiesel's book, Night, and said, "Would you mind signing my book?" And Elie Wiesel turns to him and said, "I'm sorry, no." And I'm standing there, I'm thinking, huh? I think that was the actual sound that I made. Yeah. But then he went on to say, "I can't, because it was Friday evening." And he said, "I do not write anything on the Sabbath, even my name." Now, you and I might have different feeling, but here is what struck me there, right? If I had asked him to write a letter at that moment and he said no, I would get it, because that's a lot. But it would be so easy to scratch your name. And if you've ever seen his signature, it does look like a scratch. Really, we're looking at 1 second. That's it. But he said no. And part of it is that, particularly for sort of Jewish folks who are Orthodox and so on, it's a very, very strict adherence to this. Well, you and I have inherited this idea of the Sabbath. And we, not those of us in this room, but there are some folks who would say, when you read the biblical text, when you read the Bible, you must take everything what? Literally. Okay? Now, I don't think you can do that and get out of the book of Genesis, let alone Exodus. But what does Exodus say about the Sabbath if you don't keep it? That you should be put to death. Now, let me help you translate that. Okay? You will die. And how will you die? Not some kind of ancient existential, I will live until I'm 100 die. No, you don't keep the Sabbath, and as a community, we're going to have to kill you. So I think the whole taking everything literally dies many times before this, but definitely really die here. But then there's something else here that I want to point out. Okay. There's a text in Exodus that I find that speaks about the Sabbath that is remarkable. And it says that the people should keep the Sabbaths. Sabbaths. Not Sabbath, but the Sabbaths. Let me repeat that. They should observe the Sabbaths. Now, this might come as a surprise to some of us. Maybe, as sometimes is the case, I'll confess, when we read along, we're so accustomed to knowing what we're sort of expecting that we just kind of keep reading. But in this case, it says Sabbaths, which means, unless you think that this is an accident, which, by the way, let me help you out, it isn't. The Hebrew is plural, and so the translation really is plural. I mean, you can't just say, well, wink, wink, let's not put the plural in there. So we have to think, what are the Sabbaths? Which means, in my view, by the way, there's no index at the back here to tell you, let me tell you what it means. So we read and we interpret. And it seems to me that it points to not only that which is once a week, but something that is larger, that governs all of life, that has both a social and economic factor to it. Because right, sometimes a Sabbath could be what? The year of Jubilee, where you start over. By the way, this would not go over. I'll tell you right now, if you ever hear someone preaching this, right, send me a note and let me know who is doing this, because you're not going to hear it. Why? Because it would absolutely, frankly, bluntly stated, undermine everything in our society. Because it is about what? You're starting over and with shared wealth. Every 49 years. Let's start over. How's that going? How is that working out for us? Right? It's funny the kinds of things you hear in the public domain. This is not one of them. This is not one of them. But it does say Sabbaths, which means it's not only a moment in time where you can then go home and write in your journal, I kept the Sabbath today, and so on. This is about all of life. And because we might not publicize what we do on the Sabbath on a weekly basis, if you actually take the year of Jubilee seriously, then everyone knows. And it's a reminder that we are members of a community. Now, let me give sort of a loose analog to this, in case we're wondering. When Cain killed his brother Abel, and we experience, for the first time, biblically speaking, right, fratricide. There is a note in that text, by the way, let me back up, not a footnote, but there is a section in that text that says, even what? The ground, right, will do what? Will cry out for the blood, right? And in the Hebrew, it says bloods. Not blood, but bloods. And it almost forces us to think about, violence against each other. And, it's not, yes, it's about fratricide. And I'm back. I know we know what that means, but of course, fratricide is what? The killing of one's brother, of one's sibling, right? The killing of one's brother. Okay. But we know that they said the bloods, it's almost as all of the violence that happens in our lives, even though we may not know, it will still scream out. And it only does that to ensure that we don't continue. That's the reason. And you might know, by the way, just for the record, how that ends for Cain. And I think there's a lesson here, larger, not just for us, but for us as a community, as a nation. How does it end for Cain? What does God do with Cain? Banishes him to live in the east of Eden, right? So he's punished, but also when he says to God, I'm scared for my life. And I know you can have all kinds of questions. You might be asking, well, who in the world is out there that I should be scared about, right? And go ahead and ask me, and my answer is going to be, I have no idea. Okay? But God says, you're banished, you're punished, but also you are protected. Okay? It's one of these things that comes together, if you will, even in the most heinous type of crime. So, you will keep my Sabbaths, it says. Okay. And then we're told in that same text that on the seventh day, what does God do? And we see this also in Genesis. But the Sabbath idea is generated out of the Exodus event, really. And in that moment, we are told that on the seventh day, God rested. But God does something else on the seventh day. There's a word that is used here that is, we've seen it before. Gesundheit. Nefesh. Again, I think it might have been a long while ago, I refer to this word. Okay, it's not uncommon in the Hebrew Bible. It's in several different places, but it's not an easy word to grasp. And sometimes it is translated soul. Okay, which, by the way, I know doesn't make it any easier for us to grasp. I mean, I can't send you home and say, next week, as we conclude this section here, I want, I don't know, an artistic rendering of soul. Okay? We'll end up with something that we saw this morning in the children's thing, right? Yeah. Because we can't capture it. But the word is also translated in a variety of other ways. Sometimes it's translated refreshed even, or even reselfed. Walter Brueggemann uses that word. I want to be sure that I give credit there, as reselfed. And what it says here is this, that on the seventh day, God rested and God was reselfed. Let me repeat that. On the seventh day, God rested and God was resold. On the seventh day, God rested and God was refreshed. And so let me remind us again of something that we already know, and that is here. If we, human beings, are created in the image of God, okay, then what must we do? And I know, and by the way, this is a wonderful group, and I love this group, and you remind me so often sometimes of the years when I taught, and I ask a question, and all of my students think it's a rhetorical question. And sometimes I have to remind them, no, this is not a rhetorical question. Actually, I do want a response here. That's right.
Well, it was a trap, so that's the point.
Yeah.
Spring traps on.
I know.
Reach in and grab the fruit from the trap.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Yeah,
This is another trap right
I appreciate. Thank you for playing. I appreciate it. It's a trap, he says. Yeah. In fact, I know the answer, but if I say anything, I know he's going to do some kind of fancy Socratic idea with a follow-up question. It's true. It's true. But think about it, right? What we have here is not sort of a prescriptive idea. What we have here is, I believe, is a description, right? What does it mean to rest and to be resouled? If God does this, and here's the which is very common, nephesh, is 99% of the time in the Hebrew Bible is a noun. There are only 3 instances in the Hebrew Bible where it's a verb. And this is one of them. And it's in reference to God. So that should tell us something here, by the way. That should tell us something. Every now and again we have a word that is instructive. This is one of them. If this is a verb in reference to God, frankly, choosing to rest and be recreated, what must this mean for us human beings? Right? Not, again, there is no prescription here, but it is descriptive, right? It is descriptive. I'll give you one other seemingly unrelated example, what we might call kind of an intertextual example here. And this is not, I will admit, this is not a trick question, but it's not an easy question. Okay? When God is about to create, if you will, a partner for Adam, right? Genesis. Because God said that the man should not be alone, right? That the man should not be alone. That the Adam should not be alone. We want to be clear. Because the Hebrew there is not a gender man. Okay? So, just in case we were wondering. The word that is used there, which gives us our English word Adam, but it's Adam. And the word for a gender man is Ish. And woman is Isha. That's a whole different Hebrew 101 class. But at this point, right, the word that is used there to describe the woman that God is about to create is, part of the word is Ezer. Okay? Ezer. Okay? Doesn't ring a bell, does it? No. But when I tell you, then you will say, oh yes. Because it's part of the word Ebenezer. It's the same ending of the word Ebenezer. Okay? Now, why is this important? Because Ezer, not Scrooge. I know you're thinking Scrooge. But Ezer, of course, often translated helper. Okay? But here is the parallel. Okay? This is the only time in the Hebrew Bible where that word is used in reference to a human being. Every other reference is to God. Okay? So why is this important? Similarly, right? It's a rarity. Ezer is only used in reference to a woman. That's it. That's it. And by the way, the guys that I'm looking in your faces here with a kind of a quality of disappointment here, Tommy, no, okay? It's only. Okay? So there is something that really should strike a chord here. And by the way, I don't have an answer. Think about what this means for us. Think about what this means to be refreshed for the Sabbath. Think about what this means to rest on the Sabbath. I mean, this is the question. What does this mean? And why? What does it mean so that we don't end up being, if you will, legalistic and rigid about it? Because it's an invitation. And in matters of invitation, there is no sort of legalist, you can't insist. So what does it mean to rest? I mean, think about it. Right? Where do we first hear that word, to be recreated? Everyone in this room knows. And I would venture, I'm always careful to say 100% of anything, but I would venture everyone in this room had that as part of our vocabulary growing up. It had to do with what? A time for what when we go to school? Recreation. Recreation. Right? It's recreation. It's a time to rest. Right? Yeah. It's recreation. And what happens? As we so often do with children who grow up, we stop having recreation. We stop asking questions. Right? We do. By the way, that is not a virtue. And here's the text saying, find a time for recreation. Couple other things about the Sabbath. Again, the Sabbath, if you will, particularly in the Greco-Roman world, all right, by some of the thinkers and writers at the time, they were very suspicious about the Jewish idea of the Sabbath. And people like Juvenal and others said that this whole idea about the Sabbath and this time of rest is what? It is just a smokescreen for laziness. Yeah, right? Yeah, sure. Okay, you're telling me this is kind of a noble ideal that we have to rest on this. Oh yeah, you're just lazy. That's what they said. But Philo made a case for the Sabbath. And Philo says that actually it's not laziness. It is not relinquishing of duties. In fact, it's a time of rest from work, but also a time of rest to prepare for work. Right? No, is my belief. And here's why. For example, the great Abraham Heschel, who maybe many of you know, right? Who is one of these sort of monumental figures, 20th century figures in America. A former Jewish professor, but also active civil rights person. Okay. He said, no. He said, as tempting and as sort of almost good as Philo's idea is about this, it's not. That in fact, Sabbath should not be a time to prepare for work. It should be a time of rest for its own sake. You might still go back on Monday or whenever, but it can't be seen, where work becomes the definition of our lives, and therefore, I need to get a break so I can prepare for tomorrow. And Heschel, with whom I agree fully, says, no, in fact, that's not the case. So what do? How do we help others in need? When in fact, as we heard this morning, for those who have such a need, but for whom we may not necessarily have any idea of a quid pro quo, that we don't have to get something in return, that we do this, again, as in fact Jesus teaches, if you are going to fast, how must you do it? Do it actually in the closet. I mean, figuratively speaking, right? Don't let the whole world know, because if that's all you're interested in, okay, then you've gotten your reward right there. Don't go around thinking, I can't believe I've been fast. No. By the way, if you want, because fasting should be what you do for others. And so, once again, I have to say, as I've been thinking about this during the week, and my mind, when it should be focused and wasn't, is thinking, how do we help? How do we care? When there is no prescription for this, except we tell each other, be kind, be caring, be thoughtful, be compassionate. And by the way, we should not be surprised that even words like care have to do with what? I mean, think of the word caritas. It means what? Love. And the root of the word means heart, just for the record. Okay? It's the word that gives us words like what? Cardiac and cordial. It's the same root. Okay? Or cardo, which is the road that runs through the heart of a city in ancient times. Okay? Same word. What does it mean to actually live a life when you have nothing either that you expect in return, but that you don't have some kind of under the table understanding that if you do this for me, I have a couple of things I'd like you to do, I can do this for you, but if,
Quid pro quo.
which by the way, many folks in this society might never have been using that Latin phrase in our lives, but now it's part of our vocabulary. So I'll end with this, and we'll go back to there is no what's in it for me. Think about this, for example. Prometheus, right? Greg looks at me and he laughs and he says, oh, not another story about Prometheus. Prometheus, of course, famously gave what to human beings? Fire, right? He gave human beings fire. For what in return? Nothing. There was no footnote that says, I'm going to give you fire, but I need some stuff. He gave human beings fire. But who is not happy about this? Zeus. Zeus says, how dare you give, you cannot be kind of, to use modern language, giving away the store for nothing. And by the way, to show you that I'm not happy about this, I'm going to punish you. By the way, thankfully none of that makes sense today, right? There's no punishment for giving away free stuff. But Zeus says, you're going to be punished. And of course, Prometheus, as you know, famously is punished in this kind of perpetual cycle of, remember? Tied to a rock, and the eagle, I mean, the eagle might not be appreciated being called a crow, as you know. But the eagle, right, would of course peck away at his liver day after day after day, and the next day the liver is regenerated and the eagle pecks away and pecks away. And he's tied to a rock into this perpetual state of you can't die, but you can't live. Until our friend Hercules rescues him. Again, not for a quid pro quo, but two things happen here. One, sometimes we rescue when we see that an injustice is happening, and it does not necessarily mean that there is something in it for me. Though, in the larger scheme of things as a human being, when something good is done for one, right? Maybe, that old thing, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? When the tide rises for one, it benefits all. A rising tide. When I do a good on your behalf, and that rises you, it benefits us. We might not do that for our own sake. But secondly, right, there is no what's in it for me, either from Prometheus or from Hercules. And in all of the murmurings, in all of the complainings, God nonetheless provides. Now, if you read on into the text, it said that the people lived on manna for the next 40 years. And I'm thinking, you know, you and I struggle to eat leftovers for 2 days in a row, okay? But they're going to have 40 years eating of, and I quote, what is this stuff? Okay? One final thought here. 6 days, let me leave you with this. 6 days is not enough. Dayenu, as you know, is sort of a famous Hebrew statement. Dayenu meaning it should be enough. 6 days is not enough. In our lives, we need a seventh day. It is the seventh day that brings the circle full. 6 days is not enough. It is the seventh day that creates fullness for all of us. And it is necessary not in a little part, but it is necessary because this is exactly what God has instituted. Fullness and rest and recreation for us. Okay? And a final thought, this might not mean much to us. There's a Hebrew phrase that is pronounced Altira. And if ever Altira would be relevant in our lives and in our society and in our world, it would be at this time. It is the most common repeated phrase in the Bible. And it means fear not. Fear not. Sometimes translated, do not be afraid. Okay? And the only way that phrase makes sense is what? Okay, think about it. If I tell you, do not be afraid or fear not, it means that there is something to be afraid about. We do not go around telling people, fear not, when you're about to have your breakfast, unless there's something in that pancakes that you should not be eating. It only makes sense if there is something to be afraid about. And it is no surprise to me that throughout the whole canon, the phrase Altira is repeated again and again, and it reminds us that sometimes we live in moments of such fear where the word of grace comes in a statement that says, do not be afraid, and let me tell you why. All right, we need to stop there, but here's the thing. We'll conclude this section of what we're doing, all right? We'll look at some Judges stuff, which is not fun, but we'll look at that, I know. But it seems to be a good path into the darkness of Lent. And what Pastor Dave and I have suggested as we think about Lent is to work through the Lenten lectionary text. Okay? So we will look at these texts as they deal with that journey from Ash Wednesday through to Easter. All right? And we begin that the first week in March, but we finish this up next week. Okay, thanks everyone. Yeah.